Success Small Farms Education Program. Today's presenter is Lauren Golden. Lauren is a University of Idaho Extension educator located in Blaine County, which is the Sun Valley area. I'm Colette D. Phelps, and I will be your moderator today. I'm located in Moscow, Idaho, on University of Idaho's main campus. I have some webinar tips. If this is your first webinar with us, sometimes your bandwidth can slow down the sound or freeze your computer screen during the webinars. So it is helpful to close all the other programs that are running on your computer. If you're having any problems with your sound, you can look at your registration welcome email, and it will have a call-in number. If you decide to call in on your phone to listen to the webinar, just go ahead and mute your computer so you don't get any feedback. You'll see that you have both a question box and you have a chat box. Any questions that you have for Lauren, please go ahead and type those in the question box, and we'll be monitoring that. We have several breaks during the webinar where we'll be able to read your questions to Lauren and she'll be able to answer them. If you're having any trouble with your speed, your sound, some technical glitches, go ahead and type those in the chat box. And Amanda Snyder, the Cultivating Success Program Coordinator for Idaho, is standing by to help you with any of those challenges. We will have handouts of today's slides available for you to download on your computer. They're going to be posted on the Cultivating Success website, and at the end of the webinar, I'll show you where to find those handouts.
Perfect. Well, I will get started. This is Lauren Golden again. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. And a brief outline of what we'll discuss in this short webinar is Soils 101. So we won't necessarily be soil experts, but we will be enough experts to get an idea of how our soils impact our crops and how we want to manipulate our soils in order to have the best crop production. Secondly, we'll talk about soil management, so how to apply some of those soil knowledge components to managing soil, and lastly, cover crops. Before we jump in, I'd like to get an idea of who is on the webinar today.
Great. So Amanda, you'll be the one today to be launching the polls, which are in your chat bar or by your chat bar. So here's the first poll, everyone. There's 2 questions, and you can go ahead and answer the box that pertains to you. So the first one is asking if you're a farmer, student, educator, researcher, and the like. And the second is asking where you're located. Amanda is able to monitor the responses, and when we get close to 100%, she'll go ahead and share the results. So we'll give you a few minutes to go ahead and answer these questions.
%80 have completed the poll.
Okay, we'll just take a couple more seconds and then we'll go ahead and show you the results.
93% have completed the poll. Okay, we're at 93%.
Great, let's go ahead and see the results. Excellent. Well, about 1/3 of our participants today are farmers and ranchers. We have several educators, researchers, technical assistance providers on today. And what we see is about half of our participants are located up here in North Idaho, another 1/3 in Southwest Idaho, a few in Central Idaho, and then we have 1 person logging in from Washington. So thanks so much for showing us those results, Amanda. We'll turn this back over to you, Lauren.
Okay. So the first part of the presentation will be Soils 101. It'll be a very abbreviated semester-long course in soils. This is a very the textbook definition of soil. It's essentially a mixture of varying proportions of inorganic mineral and rock particles. It has living and dead organic matter, which is usually about 2 to 3% of the soil. And then the remaining 50% of the soil is pore spaces. So it's essentially the voids in the soil particles where air or water is, and it allows nutrients to diffuse through the soil or air to aerate the soil for microorganisms. So that's essentially what soil is, just the basic component. So how is soil formed? Again, this is a very old school textbook visual, but I really like it because it shows kind of the geological aspect of how soil is formed and why soil is different depending on where you are located. So the major components of soil formation, we first start with the parent material or the parent bedrock. So we have the geological conditions that make up the soil particles. And then with that bedrock, the other factors are topography, whether we have certain geological features like mountains, more rocks, more boulders, more sun exposure, different aspects. Then we have climate, which is a huge factor. We either have, if we're looking at wet climates, for example, in northern Idaho, we might have more acidic soils due to that rain. Whereas here in southern Idaho, where we're a little bit more dry, we have more basic soil. So that's one factor that really differentiates different parts of our soils in the state. Another component that's really important for shaping the what type of soil you have and what type of soil structure you have is living organisms. So when we think of places like Hawaii, where they have lots of climate, they have warmer temperatures, they have lots of rain in certain aspects of the islands, and they have lots of vegetation. So all three of those things are interrelated, but that vegetation breaks down quickly in that type of climate where it's warmer and wetter, and thus the soil is drastically different. It's constantly being recycled. Whereas in the desert, the factors of the climate impact our living organisms as to what we see on our landscape. And so often in these climates here in southern Idaho, we don't have a lot of dense vegetation in certain areas of the state. And thus the soils are very basic. There's also not a lot of organic matter. There's not a lot of breakdown of material. And then the final factor is time. So with all these factors combined, we get certain aspects to our soil. And I mentioned again here in southern Idaho, we have very basic soils. Other parts of northern Idaho can be drastically different where there's more acidic soils. And all these factors of climate, the parent bedrock, the living organisms that are supported by that climate and how they're broken down, the topography and time essentially shape our soil structure. So soil type, this is just a soil pyramid. And again, I'm boiling down some very basic components in a short 15-minute segment on Soils 101, but all soil is comprised of either clay, silt, or sand, and it's comprised of usually a mixture of those. And so if you look at a soil result, sometimes you might see the term loam, and that means there's a mixture of the different soil types. So you're either getting a mixture of clay and silt, and so you might be called a clay silt loam. So if we look at the top of the pyramid, you can see there's more dominant clay. As you move to the right, you can see that's where the silt's located. And as you can move to the other side of the triangle, you can see that's where the sand aspect is. And as you start to move along the sides of the pyramid and let's start with the sand. If your sand starts to decrease, then you're starting to move to the silt side and you start to look at a sandy loam soil or a medium loam soil and a silty loam soil. So essentially this triangle just identifies what percent of either clay, sand, or silt do you have. And we'll go further into what that means, whether you have more sand, clay, or silt, although many of you have an idea, especially if you have very clay-like soils or very sand-like soils, as to what that will mean for your farm or garden operations. So do any of you know the exact soil type you have. And if so, I was going to have you type that in the chat box. But for this poll, since many of you might not know the exact soil type you have, whether that's a, here in Idaho or southern Idaho where I'm located, we have a lot of clay silt loam is our predominant soil type. But many of you might not know that, so in the poll I wanted to ask, do you notice whether you have more clay, sand, or silt in your soil, or what do you think you have more of?
So Amanda, if you'd like to launch that poll. There's 2 questions. Oh, Amanda, this was the first poll, so switch back to the next one. We don't see the second poll yet. Nope, we're still in the first poll. So we're having a technical problem with the polls. So sorry about that, everyone. If you can just hang on. See if we can get the second poll launched. Well, let's continue, Lauren. Okay. And I will go try to see what's happening with the polls.
Okay, we have one participant, Carrie, who said she has a sandy loam soil. So moving on to the next slide, when we start to think of our soil type, it's going to impact our soil structure. So as you can imagine, you can interpret these images, especially the ones on the left, to show more sandy-like soils. And as you move all the way to the right, you can imagine those are very clay-like soils where it's predominantly clay. So loam soils are very good in the sense that they combine some sort of mixture of soils, because we don't really want all sand, we don't really want all clay, and we don't really want all silt. You usually want some sort of combination of the 3. So you can imagine that with a sandy soil, like this image on the left, that water is going to flow through it very readily, which also means nutrients are going to flow through it readily, which means as you fertilize or use some sort of organic fertilization program, those nutrients are going to flow through that soil very rapidly. And so will water. So that means your soil doesn't hold water very well. As we start to move into the middle of those images, you can see how some of these soil particles are actually starting to form together, which forms soil aggregates, which is good. We want soil aggregates. Now, part of the role of microorganisms in the soil system is that they break down nutrients in the soil, and as they do that, they release gums, waxes, and resins. And those gums, waxes, and resins are what essentially combine soil particles into soil structure. So they start to bind together. And as they bind together, they create a much stronger soil network. So that means water can bind onto soil particles more easily, nutrients can bind onto soil particles more easily, which means that it doesn't flow through the system outside of the root zone. Having soil aggregates that are similar to that blocky images is good, because it means nutrients aren't flowing through it rapidly. Doesn't mean water's flowing through it rapidly, but you can still see pore spaces. You can still see that soil nutrients are remaining in the system long enough in the root zone so that roots can take up that water and take up that nutrients before it's outside of the root zone. So when you think about, since we weren't able to see in the poll what type of soil you have, you can start to think, how does your soil form? If you went out there to pick it up with your hand and feel its crumble factor is another way to think of it. How does it crumble? Does it crumble really quickly, which would indicate that there is not a lot of soil aggregates, meaning not much is binding together? Does it crumble not so well, meaning that pieces are sticking together more tightly, which means you have good soil aggregates, which would indicate that you have a good loam soil with a mixture of sand, silt, and clay, and that you also have good microorganisms that are helping to create those gums, waxes, and resins. So I want to move to the questions section because I know this was a very abbreviated Soils 101, and we're going to dive into how to manage soil just with these basic components of knowing your soil aggregates, how does it crumble, whether you have more clay or sand, and then how do we manage based on that. So I want to open it up for questions before we move on to soil management.
I don't see that we have any questions yet. So if anyone has questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, and we will pick those up on the next break, our next question break.
Perfect. And we had one more participant say that they have clay loam soil. Okay, so type in your questions and we'll get to those in a minute, but I'll move on to soil management. So again, we're not soil scientists after that quick 10 minutes, but we can be somewhat experts deciding, okay, what we see above ground is what we, primarily focus on, but I want you to start thinking about what's happening above ground and how that's being impacted below ground. So we're taking those ideas of, okay, what type of soil do I have? Is it more clay? Is it more sand? Or is it a good loam mixture? And are my aggregates good? So we're going to think about how those factors impact what's happening above ground. Because oftentimes if there's nutrient deficiencies or water issues, those are going to be directly related to your soil. So I like to keep soil management very easy because it can get very complex, but for farmers and gardeners, you have a lot to worry about. You're worrying about what type of plant, you're worrying about disease issues, you're worrying about all sorts of other things. So I want to keep soil really simple. Your main goal is to essentially supply adequate soil nutrients for your plants and increase organic matter. I will always vote that increasing organic matter is going to be very important, just as important as adding soil nutrients. So if those are our main goals, you look at that visual, okay, we're going to plant our plants and let's just make sure that we got the appropriate nutrients or the best appropriate nutrients we can produce in the soil for our plants, and then let's always constantly be looking at replenishing organic matter. That's our goal, and our action in order to do that is essentially, if we boil it down to our macronutrients, is looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then organic matter. So the first way to do that is by doing a soil test. Let's see if this poll will work, and then I'll describe how to do a soil test. And so I'm asking, how many of you have conducted a soil test before?
So if you conducted a soil test once, twice, you test every year, you test every other year, or if you're not testing or it doesn't apply, you can click NA.
We've had 65% have answered. Okay, I'll end the poll. We have 75% who've answered.
We see that most folks have tested their soil once, 40%, so that's great. A couple others have tested twice. We have 3 people that test every year, and for about a third of our folks, they either don't test or it's not applicable to them. So thanks for running that poll, Amanda.
Perfect. So many of you do a regular soil test, which is important. And the reason I had every other year is because that's what I usually recommend. However, if some of you are already doing it every year, that's definitely the best way to know what's going on in your soil and know how to properly add amendments to your soil. But let me go over real quickly how to do a soil test if you don't do one already, or to make sure you're doing it adequately. If what we do in our office is we lend out a soil probe like shown in this image, and we recommend to clients to take a clean bucket out to their field and collect in 10 different spots randomly throughout their field or throughout their garden. Don't pick places that are abnormal or there's always, low production over there. You might want to separate that area out. You want to focus on the areas that are somewhat of an average or represent for the most part what your field looks like. So go to 10 locations throughout your field. Pick a 1-foot sample using this probe. It's real easy to push in the ground. You'll get a 1-foot core. You'll put that 1-foot core in the bucket. And after you've gathered your 10 samples, you'll mix that soil up so it's evenly mixed. And then you'll take about 1 cup worth of it and send it to a soil lab. Now, in our extension office, we do provide a soil probe, and we also provide a little baggie that sends it to a local soil lab. So depending on where you're located, you'll want to identify which lab is most appropriate for your needs. The other important factor to consider is that you want to get that soil to that lab within 24 hours ideally. So what I recommend to individuals is to either sample early in the morning and then take your soil right then and there to the post office or to the mail office, or collect it the night before, and then the following morning, put the sample in your refrigerator, and then the following morning take that sample to the P.O. box or to your mailbox. You really don't want the sample to sit out in hot temperatures. For example, the soil will start to break down, start to change, and it won't really be an accurate sample. Now, when you get a soil sample back, what's nice about it is that the lab will identify what type of soil nutrients you're low in and what type of nutrients you need to add. So, for example, if you're low in nitrogen, it'll give you a pounds per acre recommended rate to apply of nitrogen. It'll do that for potassium, phosphorus, as well as any micronutrients. The other factor it will show is your percent of organic matter. And so in most areas, organic matter can range from 1% to up to 5%. 5% would be very high and a good thing, but most people usually have about 2% organic matter or somewhere just below that. So if you have something above 2%, that's good. And you'll want to continue to monitor that percent to make sure that you're not getting too low in organic matter and finding ways to keep adding organic matter back. And one thing I always do stress is this type of source of organic matter is important. What I'm going to emphasize and present to you today about organic matter is cover crops as one source. Now, there's obviously other sources that you've been using, such as manure or compost, but one thing to be cautious of with manure or compost is to not exceed a certain salt level. So the nice thing about a soil sample result is it'll tell you the percent of salt in your soil, and it'll also tell you if you're getting too high in that salt level. And the direct cause of that salt is from manure or compost. So you'll want to be wary of that if that's your only source of organic matter has been some source of compost or manure. So I just always like to emphasize that when individuals get a soil test and then look at their soil lab results. But today what I'll be talking about is cover crops as a source of organic matter as one tool to increase your organic matter. Okay, so I've talked a lot about organic matter. So if we go back a couple slides, we were talking about our simplified goal of soil management. So the main thing is, let's make sure we add the appropriate nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then let's make sure we're constantly adding organic matter in. If we achieve those two goals, we're going to have success in the soil realm in terms of crop production. So we've just mentioned about soil testing and reading a soil lab result, a very simplified version of that, but the importance of doing a soil test and reading those soil test results to see what type of nitrogen you need to add or how much. That can be difficult, obviously, if you are organic. You can't necessarily get a formulation of this much pounds of nitrogen or this much pounds of phosphorus. So an organic system, it is more difficult, where you do have to play a little bit of a guessing game and get really good at doing this every year. You have to get really good at adding some soil mitigation product like a compost, and then doing a soil sample the following year, and starting to read those soil samples, look at the source of nutrients you're getting, and if you can get any information as to what they estimate the pounds of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium is, and starting to just be your own little scientist in terms of adding the most appropriate amount to meet those soil needs and those crop needs. So I want to talk about organic matter. The textbook definition of organic matter is decomposed living material. So that's plant material or compost, for example, that is broken down by soil microorganisms. Now, as those soil microorganisms break that material down, like I mentioned, they release those glues, waxes, and resins, and those are very important for creating those soil aggregates. So what results from that is we have better soil structure, we have a free source of nutrients, meaning part of the free nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil is produced from that plant material or that compost that is broken down by those microorganisms. So as you add organic matter, you're essentially getting some sort of free nutrients. And it also helps to hold soil nutrients in water. Now, if we go back a couple slides where we think of that visual of water or nutrients moving through that soil and percolating through, when we have better soil structure and soil aggregates, meaning it doesn't crumble easily when we put it in our fingers, that means that the soil is going to bind to water and bind to nutrients better and hold it in that root zone. Inorganic matter is essentially the keystone species, essentially, or the keystone product in soil to make that happen. So let's see if we've had any new questions come in.
We do have a couple questions, Lauren.
Okay.
Francis asks, are folks aware of the soil survey done in the 1970s, available in online PDF? It's the soil and water conservation broken down by county. So I think that's just a question about whether or not people are aware that that's available offline.
Yes, and that is a resource for knowing whether you have your exact soil type. So whether you're, for example, let's see, Carrie was a sandy loam. So she's probably been able to identify that from one of those USGS maps or soil survey maps to show her area. Now, that's useful information, so she can get a basic idea as to, okay, I have heavily, more on the clay side, or excuse me, more on the sandy side of my soil. So I'm going to be cautious about how I manage that soil, knowing that water is going to move through it quickly, and so is nutrients. So if Carrie was looking at her sandy soil, she might want to split her nutrient applications, for example. She might not want to do her nutrients only once in the spring. She might want to split that up, knowing that her soil at this point in time, knowing its basic type, is not going to hold it for very long. But the nice thing about going a little deeper is an actual soil test gives a little more specific information to your specific soil. So I do recommend both. I think it's great to know the general soil type that you have for your particular area, but then knowing it even more specifically for your particular field.
Great, thank you. We have a second question from Carrie. Carrie says, I've been told and read not to work soil when it is wet, like just after rain, because it damages the soil structure. Is this related to breaking up the aggregates?
Yes, that would be related to breaking up the aggregates. you know, it depends if you had a specific situation where, you know, I can't think of a situation where that would be beneficial if you wanted to dry out your soil more readily. But for most people, holding that soil moisture in is going to be better. So not breaking up your soil or minimizing how much tillage you do is definitely going to increase your soil aggregates and keep those aggregates together. That's the main reason that no-till is a big movement, is recognizing that tillage essentially destroys all those aggregates, and those years that those microorganisms added, you know, those gums, waxes, and resins, one plow through essentially just, you know, destroys those aggregates, and they have to start all over again.
Great, thank you for that explanation. We don't have any other questions at this time.
Okay. So the final part of this presentation is cover crops. And I love talking about cover crops as a main tool for not only adding soil nutrients, but also adding that organic matter. So what are cover crops? Cover crops are essentially any plant grown to provide living ground cover. And cover crop types can vary depending on where you are in the world. So in Idaho, what I'm going to showcase to you today are plants that we have tested and many farmers utilize here in throughout southern Idaho as well as northern Idaho. So why are cover crops important? Well, they do provide soil nutrients. So again, they're a free source of soil nutrients. Other than that, you did have to buy the seed and you did have to plant them. They aren't necessarily a fertilizer product you bought. So they are an organic source of soil nutrients. And I mentioned how microorganisms are the workhorses in the soil. So they essentially break down the carbon and nitrogen material left on the soil surface and break that down into soil nutrients and organic matter. So when we add cover crops to our soil, to our crop rotation, we essentially are adding another source of food for our microorganisms. So it kind of gets to that idea of when we think of Hawaii, where the soil is constantly being recycled because there's a lot of vegetation going on, also, you know, the rain and the warmer climate. But if we take that out and we just look at the vegetation aspect, that's one thing that we can control here in Idaho, is adding this vegetation aspect to our local ecosystem and to our soil ecosystem to create that recycling. So cover crops can increase organic matter, as I mentioned, just through that simple mechanism of microorganisms breaking down the plant material. They release that glues, gums, and waxes, and they also create that organic matter. Cover crops can provide, research shows that cover crops can provide habitats for beneficial insects. They can minimize weeds, especially in the spring. I'll showcase some species that are really good at minimizing weeds. They can reduce water use. Farmers who have utilized cover crops early on in Idaho were weary that the cover crops were essentially going to take the water from the soil, or essentially minimize the water that was available for their actual spring planted crops. But what farmers started to recognize, and I have anecdotally spoken with many farmers who quickly realized that their soil was much more moist in the spring than it had ever been. That's essentially because we've created this nice little canopy over the soil all winter, or we've done a spring planting where we've created a little canopy and less soil evaporation is going on, and essentially we're holding soil moisture in the soil. Cover crops can also reduce soil compaction. So if you have a very heavy clay soil, cover crops can help remove that soil compaction over the years. So how many of you have used cover crops before?
%71% have completed the poll. 80% have completed the poll. Any more responses? We have 80% have completed the poll. I'll end the poll now.
Great. So we can see that about 40% of folks on the call today or on the webinar today are using cover crops, and we have 47% that are not, and just a couple people that it doesn't apply to. This question doesn't apply to. So thank you so much for answering that poll.
Good. So we have about half the individuals on the call have used cover crops and some not yet. So again, I don't want to make cover crops complicated. So when I like to talk about cover crops, it's really broken down into 3 types of species that you're selecting from. You're going to look at Brassica species, you're going to look at grass species, and you're going to look at legumes. So first off, we have our Brassicas, and these are species, they're essentially mustard-like species. We have daikon radish, oilseed radish, turnips, canola, any type of other mustards. There's about 100 of different types of mustards that are out there. So these are common brassicas that do really well in Idaho. And the nice thing about brassicas is they germinate really quickly. So in our short growing season, they're a really good species to choose when you're going to get a late fall planting of your cover crop, or you're looking to do a spring planting and you really only have a short window to do it. So I'll get to the types of plantings you can do in a second, and I'll circle back to this. But brassicas are good because they scavenge nutrients. Research has shown that brassicas can scavenge just as much nitrogen from the soil and re-release it as legumes, which fix nitrogen. We did some research here in Peekaboo in Blaine County, and we found that the brassicas contributed more nitrogen to the soil than our legumes. For example, in this case, it was Austrian winter peas. So what essentially was happening is in the fall, the brassicas, you see that root there in that example of that daikon radish, it was essentially scavenging any nitrogen that was left in the soil in that fall, utilized it for its own plant growth, and then when we came back in the spring, that material was slowly decomposing all winter and early in that spring and re-releasing that nitrogen in the soil. So it's a really good way to scavenge nitrogen. It's also a good tool to add with a compost application. So in some cases, I might recommend for producers to add compost on top of their fall planted cover crops that include some of these brassicas, and those brassicas will help scavenge up whatever material is broken down from the compost or manure before winter, and it'll start to re-release that material in the spring. That's one way to essentially not lose that material. If we do a fall application, we hope that winter kind of hibernates the soil microorganisms so they're not breaking down that compost or manure we applied, but we know we're going to lose a little bit. So brassicas are a way to kind of capture it and re-release it the following year. Let me get back to one more thing. So brassicas are also really important for soil compaction. Those tap roots, and that's not even the longest tap root. There's one called a soil buster or something, a soil buster radish, and it's really good at drilling into the soil and essentially decreasing soil compaction. So if you do have a heavy clay soil, you would want to look to brassicas as one of your main cover crop tools for helping to minimize that soil compaction. And again, working with growers in southern Idaho who plant hundreds of acres of these cover crops really recognize the value of the brassicas in terms of releasing that soil compaction and breaking up that soil compaction. And if we go back to the beginning of this presentation where we talked about the importance of soil having those pore spaces that for air and water, so brassicas essentially help create those pore spaces that are vital for air to move through the soil for the microorganisms, as well as water to move through the soil for microorganisms and the crops. Another great benefit of brassicas is for pest control and weed control. So for pest control, many producers are using certain types of mustards to do a soil fumigant. So it's essentially a natural soil fumigant against nematodes. So we have many beet producers here in southern Idaho who grow a particular type of mustard that have the highest rate of fumigation to kill off those nematodes. Brassicas are good for weed control because they germinate really quickly. They're the fastest germinating out of our grasses and legumes. So if you're looking to control weeds, brassicas are going to be another tool to lean on to have a fast germinating, high, dense canopy. You see those leaves to cover up the soil and prevent competition from other weeds. And then forage quality. When we look to graze cover crops, brassicas are some of the favored ones by cattle, and I like to highlight the forage quality of all these species. So grasses are our second type of cover crops. Species that commonly work here in Idaho are wheat, barley, triticale, sorghum Sudan grass, or pearl millet. There are many other types of grasses that you might already grow and that are already working in your particular climate. So I would not overthink what type of grass to use, but find what grass works and look to those to add to your cover crop mix. Grasses are good because they add organic matter. Grasses are essentially composed of all carbon. So we're going to get the most organic matter from these grasses, which is beneficial. However, we do need time and nitrogen and microorganisms to break that carbon down and re-release it into organic matter. So grasses are good, but they're really good in a mix rather than 100% grass cover crop species. Grasses are also good with soil compaction. You'll want to look for a grass species that has a lot of thin roots. With a lot of thin roots, we can also see that soil compaction is reduced because the grass roots extend further into the soil profile and they also extend horizontally in the soil profile. So grasses have been found to also help with soil compaction and creating that pore space. And lastly, we have legumes. And I only highlight 3 here. There's many more legumes. Here I mentioned Austrian winter peas, which essentially do really well here in Idaho. We have hairy vetch, and we have many types of clovers that work. We also have chickling vetch. We also have arvika pea. And there's any type of pea that you either have already grown in your area, or if you've heard a neighbor that grows a certain pea that does really well, I would look to that pea. There's many peas to choose from, so I would look to any of your neighbors, look to the SARE cover crop book, and look on the internet, and you can also reach out to me to think about which types of peas and legumes work best. So legumes are obviously good for fixing nitrogen. They're the only plant out of the 3 that actually fix nitrogen on their own. So essentially that plant material is primarily made up of nitrogen as well as a little bit of carbon. So legumes are a free source of nitrogen and they also add organic matter. In terms of forage quality, if you're an individual who is looking to plant cover crops and also have animals graze the cover crops, which helps the animals get some free source of feed, and it also helps break down that cover crop residue so that way you can plant your next crop. The legumes are obviously going to have a high protein value and a high forage value for your animals. Legumes are also the most expensive, so that's something to think about when we start to create a mix. So in our cover crop research in Idaho, we have found that a mix is ideal as opposed to just picking one species and just making that your entire field. A mix allows you to gain the benefits from all the different species, the brassicas, the grasses, and the legumes. So in this particular picture, this is a 9-way mix, which we quickly found out was too complex, and we moved it down to a 5-way mix. So you can start to see in this mix, we have triticale, 2 types of forage peas, we have a hairy vetch, we have a starfire red clover, Austrian winter peas, Wyndham winter pea, purple top turnip, and a daikon radish. So what species are most dominant? We can see that our brassicas, those broad leaves, are the most dominant species. Those are the ones that germinated first, so they got a head start on all the other species. We can also see we have a decent amount of grass, so we have a decent amount of triticale that came up. And I don't really see much legumes in that image. If so, they're lower to the ground. I think I see a clover way down there. So what we discovered in this 9-way mix was that it was too complex and the brassicas were too heavy in it. So if we wanted more legumes to be present in this mixture, we needed to bump up the seeding rate of the legumes and reduce the seeding rate of the brassicas. So this is where you, as you start to experiment with cover crops, you get to watch and observe how the cover crops are doing in your field. So what I recommend to most producers is start with a 3-way mix, maybe one of each of the species. Pick a legume, pick a grass, and pick a brassica. And plant those, and maybe even decide ahead of time that you might bump up the seeding rate of one and lower the seeding rate of the other, depending on what benefit you want the most of. If it's weed control in the fall, or in the spring, then you might want to bump up the rate of the brassicas. If it's really legumes you're after, then you'd want to reduce the seeding rate of the brassicas and increase the rate of the legumes. And this is where you can then come out throughout the season and observe what's coming up. You can also start to observe, okay, that legume I planted, I don't really think it's doing that well. Maybe I need to experiment with another legume next time. And so that's why perhaps maybe a mix of 3 to 5 species would be good. So that way you can experiment to see which legume is most successful. We find that the peas are most successful as opposed to the clovers, which are a little bit more designed for perennial systems. So they're going to take longer to germinate, they're going to take longer to establish, and they're not really going to get to compete with the other species that are in the mix. And clovers are often more expensive seed. So reducing that seed mix is ideal, and recognizing which species are going to thrive in your mix is important. So when we think about planting options here in Idaho, we're essentially looking at doing a spring planting, which means you're looking to get out there as early as you can, as early as your soil is ready and dry to plant your cover crop mix. And you're either going to terminate or no-till into that cover crop mix your cash crop, or you're going to till it up. But most producers prefer to no-till into it, or depending on where you're at, it might just be enough residue where it's going to add some organic matter, add that weed control factor, but it's not a huge mess. Obviously here in Idaho, our climates are take a while to get started, so it's not going to be a huge tangle of vegetation for you to try to plant into. The second option is the summer fallow. So if you have a particular field which is severely degraded and you want to really replenish that field. So you could do essentially one planting of cover crops, a cover crop mix for the full season. You can essentially let all that vegetation grow throughout this season and let that material break down and come back to it next spring. You can do companion cropping or intercropping, so you could do in between rows, or like I said, you can no-till a particular, your cash crop into the cover crop mix, which is obviously the best route to go to minimize any sort of break in your growing degree days. And you can also do a fall planting. A fall planting is ideally the first part of August. As soon as you can get in there, you would want to do a fall planting. Now, fall plantings are good, but they're also tricky because you want to make sure there's enough growth before winter kill to make the effort worth it. So you want to make sure at a minimum there's about 5 weeks of growth before you expect your first frost. That would give the cover crops enough time to germinate, get above the ground, and produce enough vegetation to make that seed purchase worth it. And you'd want to also think about species that would come back in the spring. So species that wouldn't necessarily winter kill, but go dormant during the winter and start growing again in the spring for you. So that way you almost have a full season of cover crops in the fall. Then you let that material go dormant. They start to grow again in the spring. And then you can no-till your cash crop into that residue. Which sequence options would work for you? And you can select multiple options in this poll.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in with a question while this poll is being conducted. We had a question about whether or not there's opportunities to grow cover crops, but also use that same crop as a human food product.
You could. I think there are, well, it depends on, is there peas, certain peas would work. I think it's limited on harvesting equipment. So if it's a particular material that would require special harvesting equipment, then that would be a factor to consider. There would also be the factor of processing, whether there is a means to process that cover crop into what you want that end product to be. And so grazing at this point is one of the main outlets for many growers because it's an obvious way to utilize that material and it doesn't require those special, often cost prohibitive factors. But there are many cover crops that are commonly used for food products. Certain types of peas, for example, Austrian winter peas, the peas that we do grow here are often shipped to areas of Japan where they use it for certain food products. I would think there would be some other grain type materials that we could also use for a food product. So I think those are all great ideas and could certainly be explored. Just understanding what those harvesting factors and those processing factors would be the only limitations to consider.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we're at 68% with the poll completed.
Why don't we just
I'll end the
give
poll.
that a couple more seconds. Okay, here we can see that we have a real diversity of folks in terms of what they say sequence would work for them. We have a number of people that think that early spring planting or full season planting could work, intercropping, but the most are saying that an early fall planting would work best for their operations.
Yes, and an early fall planting is the most logical to start with here in Idaho. Because of our short season, it's really hard to do a spring planting and get in there in enough time before you already really need to be planting your cash crop. So a fall planting is the most logical that most producers start with. I do have a U of I cover crop publication that we can share as a handout at the end of this presentation, which identifies particular species that would work for a fall planting. And it identifies which species are going to be winter hardy, meaning they're going to survive the winter, so you can have a little bit of growth in the spring, versus species that will completely winter kill. And there are advantages to either or. If you're an organic producer, sometimes you might want a winter kill, so that way you don't have to worry about any species becoming a potential weed in your cash crop the following year. However, I found that most of the cover crops we plant, especially if they're a fall planting and then going into the spring, the material is usually not enough to become then a weed, depending on your seed equipment. So obviously if you have a no-till drill, that's the best way to overcome that issue, but oftentimes, producers don't have no-till drills, or if the local NRCS office doesn't have one to loan out, then you might want to consider a winter kill cover crop. So that way, in the spring, you don't have any residue that might conflict with your cash crop planting. So we can share that handout at the end, which really will get to those of you who are interested in the fall planting, because that will identify which species and which category they fall into as to winter kill or their ability to survive the winter and give a little bit of growth in the spring. So I have one more slide, and then I hope if there are any more cover crop questions, I would love to answer them. I realize cover crops, there's a lot to talk about, so this is a very abbreviated presentation on them, but I hope it's enough, along with the soils talk, to give you a little bit of confidence in deciding what type of cover crops are going to work for you and what type of management goals you have, whether that's decreasing soil compaction, or I just really needed to add organic matter to my soil, so which species is going to give me the most organic matter, and then deciding how to create your mix. Do you really do a heavy brassica mix to do weed control, to do that scavenging of nutrients, to reduce that soil compaction, to also add organic matter? Do we bump up the legumes so that way we make sure we get lots of nitrogen, because I'm an organic producer and this is one of my only tools to get nitrogen to my soil. So I really need to emphasize my legume use. So this last slide is about creating a cover crop plan. So this is just a simplified version where you really do have to start thinking about it a little bit early. And like now, some ideas are starting to float through your head as to what type of species do I want? When am I going to plant it? But we really need to identify the species and obtain the seed early. That's one recommendation I would say. Green cover crop seed out of Nebraska is a good source. And they're also a good source because they have a lot of information about which species work for your particular management goals. And I'm trying to think of some other local cover crop producers, but there are many. There are some in Washington as well, that all of them have a rich information about cover crops, because cover crops have gotten so much traction in the last 5 years. Many of these cover crop seed producers know a lot about which species are going to do the management goal that you're seeking. And they'll also know which species are going to work in your particular climate. So you'd really want to call these individual seed companies, explain a little bit about your situation, where you're located, so that way you can really get the right type of brassicas for you, the right type of grasses, and the right type of legumes. Secondly, on your cover crop plan, you'd want to identify the date, which is pretty easy. You're going to have to say, I can only do a fall planting, or let's figure out if I can do a spring planting, and whether I can no-till drill my cash crop into my cover crop mix. Or maybe I'm going to test it out on 1 acre before I turn my 10 acres into this type of system. So this is a good way where you can experiment and see what happens. And then planting method, that's important too when you think about that residue. And again, often the residue isn't as much as people think, especially in Idaho. So it doesn't seem to be that much of an issue depending on the species you pick. Hairy vetch is one that some growers are weary of, because depending on how long it can grow, it can become vine-like and can become a little more difficult to manage. But the other species don't have that same issue. And then management, whether you're going to no-till into that, whether you're going to till it, whether you're going to graze it, or whether you're just going to let it be and you'll continuously just no-till into that and reseed a cover crop mix each year. So I'll let Colette wrap up, but perhaps we can also identify if there's any more questions in the chat box to answer.
Absolutely, Lauren. So first I want to say that I did go ahead and put in the chat a lot of links to the resources that Lauren has referred to. So the SARE cover crops resources there, the web soil survey, and then links to 3 University of Idaho publications, 2 that were co-authored by Lauren on cover crops, and then the link to the overall U of I Extension Publications catalog. Many of our publications are free to download from the web. And then I see that Emily Erickson has also sent out a resource. She says Brad McIntyre grows seed for greencoverseed.com. And so there's some information there as well as a calculator for seed. So we have one final question, Lauren, and this is from Ruth. She says, you mentioned planting a cover crop in the fall that will grow dormant over the winter and then start growing again in the spring. What species do this from your list?
Some examples are Austrian winter peas. Those are winter hardy. So is hairy vetch. There are other peas that you'll want to look for. Other forage peas will also survive the winter. We have in our brassicas, our canolas will survive the winter. Most of our mustards will. And again, there's many radishes and there's many mustards. So we'd want to look at some of those specific ones, specific species. Again, I mentioned there's over 100 different types of mustards. That's about the same for the radishes. So when you call your individual seed company, you'd want to specify, go into a little more detail to make sure that your brassica, look at its cold hardiness, look at its winter survival. But right off the bat, I know when we've done our plots, Austrian winter peas, hairy vetch will survive the winter, canola will survive the winter, our triticale will survive the winter, especially if you do a winter wheat or winter barley, those will survive. So those are some examples of species that will do that.
Great, thank you for that. So we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much for your presentation today, Lauren. And I'll just go through the next few slides to kind of show folks where they can find the resources we talked about today. So here you'll see the Cultivating Success website for Idaho, where you registered for this webinar series. So if you go ahead and you click on webinar series, it's going to take you to the 2019 webinar recordings. From there, you can click on view the recording and go ahead and move into getting not only the recording, but the resources. The next slide, please. This is a webinar series and we are continually adding webinars. So our next webinar, which is on Tuesday, April 16th, is Packaging Economics and Food Safety Solutions for Direct Marketing of Produce. And our speaker is Ariel Agenbrod, who is located down in Ada County in the Boise area. And she'll be talking about some things that producers can think about in terms of saving money while they're also ensuring food safety on their farms. Next slide, please. Cultivating Success is a partnership of University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Food Systems Program, and the nonprofit Rural Roots. So we thank them for their partnership and support of this program. Next slide. Just after we close today's webinar, we're going to ask you to please take a couple of minutes to complete our post-webinar survey. It averages to be 4 minutes to complete the survey. It's just 5 or 6 questions. Your feedback will really help Lauren as she provides more education on soils and cover crops and help us identify different topics that you would like to see covered in future webinars. So with that, thank you so much for joining today's webinar, and we hope to see you on another webinar in the future. Thanks again and have a great day.